The Astronomicon went silent on a Tuesday. No one told me. No one could. I was 300 light-years from Terra when I felt it. Not with my ears, not with instruments, with the third eye I was born with. The eye that marked me as something other. The eye my mother called a gift, and my tutors called a weapon, and the Navi's Nobilite called an inheritance. The eye that, for 41 years, had seen the Emperor's light burning across the Immaterium like a candle in the dark between stars. It saw nothing. There is a particular horror in the absence of something you have always known. The way silence after years of sound is itself a sound. The way darkness after sight is itself a presence. I had navigated this ship, the strike cruiser Immovable Faith, through 23 warp transits. I had held the light in my mind the way a drowning man holds a rope. And now the rope was fraying, strand by strand, in my trembling hands. My name is Theomar Val, Obscurus, of House Obscurus, Navigator 2nd grade, hereditary seat holder to the Immovable Faith, since my predecessor died of warp sickness 14 years past. And this is the record I am leaving behind of the 6 days it took me to lose my God, or to find out what my God really was. Let me tell you who I was before the silence, because you should know what was destroyed before you can understand what the destruction cost. I was a man of procedure and lineage. These are not small things in the Imperium. Procedure is what separates civilization from the long night. Lineage is what separates us, the Navis Nobilite, from the shipborne masses who live and die between our transits, never seeing the Immaterium, never feeling the currents I navigated the way a riverman reads water. I wore the bandeau across my forehead waking and sleeping. Not always from modesty. There is a kind of peace in the discipline of the wrap, in the ritual of applying it each morning, in the prayer that accompanies the binding. It connects me to the line of navigators before me, to my father, my grandfather, their mothers and fathers stretching back 3,000 years of House Obscurus service. We were never space marines, never inquisitors. We were, all of us, a hereditary instrument, and there was dignity in that. I believed in the dignity of that. The navigator's cell, aboard the Immovable Faith, was kept at 17 degrees, cold enough to keep my mind sharp. Cold enough to remind me that clarity was not comfort. My predecessor, Navigator Prime Demetria Vale, had specified the temperature in her service notes, and I had honored it every transit since. On her wall I kept her charts, not because I needed them, hand-drawn star maps being largely ceremonial in an age of machine spirits and cogitators, but because her hands had made them, and hands matter. I loved my work. I want you to understand this. Not as a defense or a confession, but as context. When people imagine the Navigator, they imagine something monstrous, a mutant tolerated by necessity, and in some ships that is true. Aboard the Immovable Faith, I had the ear of Captain Soraya Veth, a woman of sharp intelligence and practical faith, and I had relationships with the officers that I would, if pressed, describe as genuine. The ship's chaplain, Brother Hadrianus, brought me hymnals from port. The chief medicae, a taciturn man named Ostor, checked my neurovitals after every transit without being asked and said very little about the results, which I appreciated. I had quarters with a window. I had books. I had the Astronomicon. The light was not just navigation. Understand this, above all other things I will tell you. To a navigator, the Emperor's light is not a tool any more than breathing is a tool. It is the fundamental condition of our work. We are born into awareness of it. We train with it for decades. It structures our perception of the Immaterium the way gravity structures the perception of the physical world. Every transit of my 41 years of service, I had entered the warp, opened my third eye, and there it was, burning steady in silver gold, that great psychic lighthouse, burning steady in silver gold. That great psychic lighthouse, 100 billion souls focused through one immortal will, visible across the impossible distances of the Immaterium. You steered toward it the way you steered toward the only light in absolute darkness, because it was the only light, because there was no other, because the warp without it was a place where nothing could be known, nothing guaranteed, nothing survived. I am telling you what it meant because when I tell you what the silence was, I want the shape of the absence to be clear. We had been in transit for 11 days when I noticed the first wrongness. The word I am choosing carefully. Wrongness. Not absence, not yet. The Astronomicon was present, burning where it always burned, southeast by celestial convention, though direction in the immaterium is more philosophy than geometry. I had checked it at the beginning of the transit, as I checked it every 4 hours, opening my third eye for the navigation vigil that was the primary duty of my station. What I noticed at the 31st hour of the 11th day was that the light felt thin. I sat with this perception for several minutes, turning it over, testing it against my instruments. The cogitator array that supports Navigator function registered nominal readings, psychic resonance at 73% of baseline within acceptable variance. The warp wake behind us showed no anomalous currents. Nothing in my instruments justified the word thin, but I had been navigating for 41 years, and instruments are not the whole of what a navigator does. We are not the machines that support us. We are pattern recognition evolved over 3,000 years of navigational lineage, and my pattern recognition was telling me something that the cogitators were not equipped to measure. I wrote it in the transit log. Subjective impression, stellar-like quality inconsistent with prior transits. Possible warp weather localized phenomenon. Monitoring. I flagged it for review and returned to my vigil. I did not call the captain. Looking back at that decision, I can tell you exactly what I was thinking, because I remember it precisely. I was thinking that a navigator's subjective impression, unsupported by instrument readings, was not grounds for disturbing a captain in the 8th hour of her sleep cycle. I was thinking that the acceptable variance on psychic resonance was 5 percentage points, and 73 was within that variance. I was thinking, and I am not proud of this, that if I raised an alarm based on a feeling, and the feeling proved unfounded, it would be the kind of thing that followed a navigator's reputation. I was also thinking, and I will not pretend otherwise, that I was afraid of what it would mean if the feeling was correct. By the 44th hour of the 12th day, the word thin was no longer adequate. I had maintained the vigil every 4 hours. Each cycle the cogitators showed nominal readings, or readings within acceptable variance. Each cycle, my third eye told me something the cogitators could not quantify. The Astronomicon was not what it had been. Not dramatically, not catastrophically, not yet. But there is a quality to a lighthouse that anyone who has navigated by one will recognize, a quality T is more than brightness. That is constancy, regularity, the reliable pulse of something that does not waver. The Emperor's light had that quality. Every transit I had ever made, every time I had opened my third eye in the immaterium, it had that quality, the certainty of it, the groundedness. What I was perceiving in its place was a pulse that stuttered. I sat in my cell for 6 hours without performing the vigil, which was a violation of protocol. The temperature was 17 degrees. My hands were folded on my knees. I was trying to find a rational explanation. Localized warp weather, which I had already noted, can create interference phenomena, something like static on a Vox channel, that can make a psychic signal seem inconsistent to the navigator even when the source is stable. I had read accounts of this, never experienced it, but the literature was clear that it was possible. What the literature was less clear on was whether localized warp weather could create a consistent, progressive degradation pattern, rather than the intermittent static of interference. What I was experiencing was not static. It was erosion. I opened the transit log and wrote for the first time something I had been trying not to write, reassessing previous notation. Signal degradation appears progressive rather than localized. Initiating archival comparison to determine historical baseline consistency. I pulled the transit logs from the past 14 years of my service on the immovable faith. I sat in my 17-degree cell and cross-referenced every navigation vigil entry I had made in every transit, looking for any previous record of this quality of perception. There was none. I wrote no historical precedent in 14 years of service. Consulting House Obscurus, ancestral navigational document. I had copies of those records, 600 years of navigational documentati. On, passed to me by my father, passed to him by his mother, going back to the founding of our house. I had never read most of them. They were legacy, not utility. You do not read your ancestors' records when the work is proceeding normally. I read them in 4 hours. What I found was not reassuring. In the 600 years of House Obscurus records, there were 3 notations of signal inconsistency. All 3 were brief. All 3 described the same subjective perception I was recording now. Not absence, but thinning, erosion. The light behaving differently from its ordinary constancy. 2 of the 3 records contained no further notation, which meant either the navigators in question concluded nothing significant, or they did not survive to conclude anything. The 3rd contained 2 words in a different hand than the rest of the entry, added after. It returned. It returned. I spent a long time sitting with those 2 words. They were comfort and they were horror simultaneously. Comfort because they implied the signal had been lost and found again. Horror because they confirmed that the signal could be lost. I had known, intellectually, that the Astronomicon could fail. Every navigator knew this. The Imperium had standing contingency doctrine for blackouts, ritual prayers for restoration, emergency navigation protocols using pulsar mapping that I had memorized and hoped never to use. The possibility of the Astronomicon failing was the background terror of my profession, the thing you did not speak of. The way sailors did not name certain storms. But intellectual knowledge and experiential knowledge are different countries. I had known this the way I knew about exterminatus as a fact in a document, not as a thing that could happen to me here. In the ship I had served for 14 years. In a warp transit I was responsible for completing safely. I was calcular, adding my options when Brother Hadrianus knocked on the cell door. I want to describe Hadrianus because he matters to what comes next. He was a small man, compact, with the deep brown skin of Talassian heritage and hands that were always slightly ink-stained from his illumination work. He had served as ship's chaplain aboard the Immovable Faith for 11 years, 2 fewer than me, and we had reached the kind of understanding that comes from years of proximity and mutual respect. He was a man of genuine faith, not performed faith. There is a difference that navigators learn to perceive. We spend a great deal of time in the warp. We develop sensitivities. He had brought me a hymnal, as he often did between transits when we were in port. But we were not in port. He had brought it to my cell door in the middle of transit. "You haven't been to the morning liturgy," he said, when I opened the door. 3 days. I looked at him. I had not realized it had been 3 days. The transit log had the hours, but I had stopped attending to them. "I have been occupied," I said. He looked at me for a moment with the particular attention that a chaplain develops across years of ministry. Not evaluation, exactly. Something more careful than that. "Come," he said. "The liturgy has already occurred, but the chapel is quiet." I went with him. I am still uncertain why. Perhaps because the isolation of the cell had become something I needed to break. Perhaps because the discovery in the ancestral records had left me with a kind of emotional charge I did not know what to do with. The chapel aboard the Immovable Faith was not large. No shipboard chapel is. But Hadrianus had spent 11 years making it beautiful in the way that a man of genuine care makes a constrained space beautiful, with attention, not resources. He had placed candles along the nave, real ones, beeswax by the smell, and their light fell across the golden aquila at the altar in a way that made the metal seem to breathe. We sat in the front pew and I did not speak for a long time. "Something has changed," Hadrianus said finally. "Yes. The ship, the light," I said. He was quiet. A chaplain knows when to be quiet. "The light is changing," I said. "In the Immaterium, I do not have another way to describe it. It is becoming something other than what it was." "The Astronomicon," he said. "Yes." Another long quiet. The candles moved in the recycled air. "Are you certain?" he said. "I am certain of my perception," I said. "I am not certain of its interpretation. That is the difficulty. Navigators are trained to trust our perceptions and distrust our interpretations. The perception is clear. The light is thinning. The interpretation, I do not know." He was holding the hymnal. His ink-stained hands turned it over once, twice. In the scripture of Saint Sabbat, he said, not as recitation but as thought, there is a passage, the light that fails may be a lesser light, not the light of the God Emperor. The fire that burns uneven is the fire of the mortal, not the divine. He paused. I do not know if that is comfort or not. It isn't, I said, but I appreciate the offering. He nodded. Will you tell the captain? I am trying to determine when the right moment is. Theomar, he said, which was the only name I had told him, the personal name, not the house name. If I were the captain, I would want to know immediately. I looked at the golden aquila above the altar. The candlelight made it shift. If you were the captain, I said, you would have been educated your whole life to believe the Astronomicon is the Emperor's will made physical, that it cannot fail while the Emperor wills it to endure. And a navigator telling you it is failing is either telling you the Emperor's will is faltering, which is heresy, or that the navigator is wrong, which is a credibility problem. Hadrianus was quiet again for a long time. Then, or it is telling you that the Emperor's will is a more complex thing than any of us were taught to comprehend. I stood. I will speak with the captain at the next watch change. I did not speak with the captain at the next watch change. What I found in the ancestral records, when I returned to them, was the thing that made the conversation with the captain suddenly more complicated than I had anticipated. It was not a navigation entry. It was a personal notation in the hand of Navigator Ilara Vial Obscurus, my great-great-grandmother, who had served 3 successive crusade fleets during a period of significant warp instability approximately 200 years prior. The notation was not in the formal log, but in a personal journal that had been bound into the back of the record volume, which was why I had not found it in my initial search. The notation read, I have spoken with the inquisitorial representative aboard. He confirms what I had begun to suspect, but could not name. The phenomenon I am recording is not unprecedented. There have been 17 documented instances of signal deterioration in the past 4 centuries, 14 resolved within 6 months. 3 did not resolve. He would not tell me what happened to the navigators aboard ships in transit during the 3 that did not resolve. He told me they were remanded to proper authority. I do not know what that means. He told me my record of the phenomenon was classified vermilion. He told me if I recorded further observations, I was to surrender them to him personally. I am writing this because I refuse to unsee what I have seen, and because whoever finds this journal may need to know that they are not alone. I sat with the notation for a very long time. 17 documented instances in 4 centuries. 14 resolved. 3 did not resolve. The navigators aboard ships in transit during the 3 that did not resolve were remanded to proper authority. My great-great-grandmother had been, by all accounts I possessed, a woman of precision and courage. She had navigated 42 transits across some of the most unstable warp corridors documented in House Obscurus records. She had survived the crusade. She had survived the return. She had died in her navigator's seat at the age of 67. In transit, which the family records noted as an honored death, the proper ending for a navigator of her lineage. She had refused to unsee what she had seen. I understood what she meant. I also understood that the inquisitorial representative 2 centuries ago had classified her observations, vermilion. I had made similar observations in the official transit log. I had not given them a classification at all, because I was a navigator, not an inquisitor, and classification of information was not my domain. But if those observations were found, and someone with inquisitorial authority reviewed them, and I was remanded to proper authority before completing this transit, the ship had 641 souls aboard. Captain Soraya Veth and her officers and her crew, and Brother Hadrianus with his ink-stained hands. Without a navigator in transit, a ship was lost. The polite word was lost. The accurate words were considerably worse. I understood, sitting in my 17-degree cell in the middle of the immaterium with the Astronomicon failing, why my great-great-grandmother had written her observations in a private journal, bound into the back of a record volume, rather than in any official record at all. I took the transit log. I reviewed my entries. I rewrote them, not falsified. I want to be precise about this. I removed the interpretive language. I replaced signal degradation. Appears progressive with Kagedita readings within acceptable variance. Navigator monitoring continued. I replaced every reference to my subjective perception of thinning with technical readings that were, in fact, accurate. 73% of baseline, within acceptable variance. I made my observations true, but incomplete. My great-great-grandmother had written, "I refuse to unsee what I have seen." I had seen it. I just stopped writing it down. On the 14th day of transit, the Astronomicon failed entirely. I was in the middle of a navigation vigil. I had opened my third eye. I had orientated to the beacon the way I had orientated to it 10,000 times across 41 years of service. I reached, with that part of me that was not quite perception and not quite sense, but something the tutors of House Obscurus called attunement, for the silver-gold certainty that had always been there. Nothing, not silence, exactly. The warp is never silent. The warp is a screaming, shifting, impossibly complex sea of psychic energy and half-formed entities and the emotional residue of 10,000 years of human suffering pressed through the filter of the immaterium. It is never quiet. But where the Astronomicon had been, there was now only warp. Raw, undifferentiated, directionless warp. I closed my third eye. I pressed my bandeau against my forehead with both hands and held it there, because my hands were shaking, and I needed something to press against. I opened my third eye again. Nothing. I held myself very still for what the cell's chronometer told me was 22 minutes, though it felt like the space between heartbeats. Then I opened a channel to the captain's station. "Captain Veth," I said. My voice was steady. I was surprised that it was Sard. "TD. Navigator," she said. "Report. I need you to secure all crew to their stations and begin emergency transit protocols," I said. "And then I need to speak with you privately." A pause. "Emergency level. I do not wish to cause panic," I said. But yes. Captain Soraya Veth was not what most people imagine when they imagine a captain of the Astra Militarum's naval arm. She was slight, with close-cropped gray hair and an expression of habitual assessment, as though she perpetually catalogued the world for structural weaknesses. She had a service record of 30 years unbroken transit. She had never lost a ship. She came to my cell. She sat in the chair I placed for her. She listened to everything I told her, everything. I had made the decision during the 22 minutes of silence. My great-great-grandmother had hidden her observations and survived to record her survival. I did not know what the remanding to proper authority meant for the navigators in the 3 unresolved incidents, and I did not know if Soraya Veth had inquisitorial contacts or inquisitorial obligations. But I knew that 641 souls were aboard this ship, in transit without navigation, and that a captain with 30 years of experience deserved the complete information she needed to protect them. I told her about the thinning. I told her about the ancestral records. I told her about my great-great-grandmother's notation. I told her that I had revised the transit log, and why. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. "How long have you known the signal was degrading?" she said. Her voice was not accusatory. It was the voice of someone cataloging structural weaknesses. 12 days, I said, and you said nothing. I was uncertain of my interpretation. And then I found my great-great-grandmother's record, and I became uncertain of something else. She looked at me. "You were afraid of being remanded." "I was afraid of being remanded while the ship was in transit," I said. "The distinction matters." She looked at me for a long time. Then she did something I had not anticipated. She laughed. Not a warm laugh. The laugh of someone who has just confirmed a very dark suspicion. "You protected the ship," she said. "I hope so. You also destroyed official records. Or rather, declined to create them." "Yes." She stood and walked to my cell's porthole, which looked not onto space but onto the internal structure of the navigator's sanctum. She was quiet for several minutes. "I have a cousin," she said, and then stopped. I waited. "My cousin was a navigator," she said. "Not House Obscurus. House Vulk." Minor house, single vessel assignment. She served on a trade vessel, the Pellucid Canticle, in a transit 15 years ago. She stopped again. The ship came out of transit without her. The official report said she had been lost to warp sickness. The captain of the Pellucid Canticle sent my family a personal letter that said something different. He said she had reported anomalous beacon conditions. He said an inquisitorial representative aboard had taken her into custody. He said he did not know what happened after that. She turned from the porthole. Her face was controlled in the way of someone who has been controlling it for a long time. The Pellucid Canticle completed the transit, she said, with a new navigator, one who, presumably, did not report anomalous beacon conditions. The cell was 17 degrees. I could see her breath. How do we navigate without the beacon? I said. You tell me, she said. This is what I told her. Pulsar mapping, the emergency navigation protocol I had memorized and hoped never to use, is theoretically possible and practically murderous. Pulsars are stable enough in the material universe to serve as fixed points of reference. In the immaterium, they exist as echoes, psychic impressions of physical reality, fainter than the astronomicon by orders of magnitude, more difficult to read, more prone to distortion. Navigating by pulsar mapping in open warp is like navigating a storm-tossed ocean by memory of the stars you saw 3 nights previous, before the clouds came. It can be done. It has been done. The survival rate is not something the novice Nobelite publicizes. We were currently by my last accurate position fix before the signal loss, approximately 40 light-years from our destination, not an impossible distance. The warp wake we had been riding was relatively stable. If the warp weather held and I could maintain positional accuracy with pulsar mapping, we had a reasonable probability of making translation. I did not tell her what reasonable probability meant in terms of exact numbers, because the numbers would not have helped, and we had no alternative. I told her I would begin immediately. She stood to leave and stopped in the cell doorway. The log revisions, she said. I am going to note that I reviewed Navigator's logs and found them consistent with the reports I received. That will be true. I received no reports. Yes, I said. There is an inquisitorial representative assigned to this fleet, she said. Not aboard this ship, but at our destination. If we reach it, there will be one. I know. If we arrive safely, she said, your testimony about beacon conditions will be the testimony of a navigator who brought his ship home. That carries weight. Yes, I said. She looked at me for a long moment. And if we do not arrive safely, the testimony will not matter. No, I said. She left. I heard her footsteps in the corridor, precise and even, moving toward the bridge. I want to tell you what 6 days of pulsar mapping navigation is. The vigil for standard navigation is 4 hours, then rest. The vigil for pulsar mapping is continuous because the signal is too faint and too variable to permit the instrument-assisted intervals that standard navigation allows. I slept in the chair. My meals were brought to me. I was aware of almost nothing outside the narrow column of perception that constituted my operational consciousness, the third eye open, the warp pressing against the boundaries of the sanctum, and far away in the immaterial dark, the faint and unreliable echoes of pulsars that I was using to build something that approximated a map. The warp changed around us, not dramatically, not catastrophically, but I was more sensitive to it than I had ever been, because I was navigating without the astronomican's orienting light, and without that light, the warp's nature was more directly apparent to me. The immaterium is a place of accumulated human emotion stretched across dimensions that human minds were not designed to perceive. Every human fear and grief, and rage and longing that has ever existed has left a trace in the warp. Most of the time the astronomican's light ordered those traces into something navigable, created a kind of psychic architecture that allowed a trained navigator to move through the immaterium with controlled direction. Without it, the traces were just present, raw and undirected, like standing in a crowd of the dead. On the 3rd day of pulsar mapping, I experienced something that I have not been able to fully explain or categorize. I was holding position by a cluster of pulsar echoes in the far immaterial distance when I perceived something in the direction where the astronomican had been. Not the astronomican. Something different. A presence that was not light and not darkness, but something in between. Something vast and quiet in the way that oceans are vast and quiet from the perspective of something very small. Not malevolent, not benevolent, present, ancient, watching. Perhaps though watching implies an attention that I am not certain the thing possessed, I did not look at it directly. Navigators are trained never to look at things in the warp directly. You observe peripherally, obliquely, the way you observe a candle flame to preserve your night vision. I held the pulsar cluster in my primary attention and watched the presence in the periphery of my third eye's perception. It did not move toward me. It did not speak. But it was there, in the place where the Astronomicon had been. And it was old in a way that the word old cannot fully contain. I had the impression, though I do not know what to do with this impression, that it had been there before the Astronomicon, that the Astronomicon had been, in some sense, placed over it, or placed against it, that the light I had navigated by for 41 years was not simply a beacon, but also in some structural sense, a wall. I am recording this because my great-great-grandmother wrote, "I refuse to unsee what I have seen. I saw this. I do not know what I saw, but I saw it." Brother Hadrianus came to the sanctum on the 4th day. He stood in the doorway, which he knew enough not to cross without permission. "I have been praying for you," he said. "I know," I said, which was true. I had felt it. Shipboard prayer has a particular psychic texture in the immaterium, a kind of warmth that is perceptible if you know what to look for. His prayers were structured and sincere, and they felt like the beeswax candles in the chapel, small, steady, genuinely offered. "How are you?" he said. "Operational," I said, which was the navigator's word for what a medicae would call critical but stable. He stood quietly for a mom. "And is there anything you need me to do? Tell me something true," I said. He considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "In the 40 years I have served the God Emperor," he said, "I have seen things that my training did not prepare me for. I have seen faith produce miracles and fear produce atrocities, and sometimes I could not distinguish them from each other in the moment. What I have come to believe, through observation rather than instruction, is that the God Emperor is not the God Emperor I was taught about. He is something larger, more complicated, more costly." A pause. "That is not comfortable to know, but I think it might be more true than the alternative." "What is the alternative?" I said. "That the light failing means he is failing," he said. "And I don't believe that. What I have seen in 40 years suggests that our failures are not his. They are ours." I held the pulsar cluster. The vast, quiet presence was still in my peripheral perception, still and ancient, and watching something I could not name. "Something is in the warp," I said, "where the Astronomicon was. Something very old. I don't know what it is." He was quiet for a long time. Then, softly, "The scripture of the anamnesis says that the God Emperor stands between mankind and what the darkness contains. Not above the darkness. Between. He is not standing between anything at the moment," I said. "No," Hadrianus said. "He is not." Silence. "Keep going," he said. "That is all I have." "I know," I said. "That is enough." He left. I held the pulsars and kept going. On the 6th day, I felt something that I had forgotten I was hoping for, not the Astronomicon. Let me be clear about that. What I felt was not the full signal, not the silver-gold certainty of 100 billion souls focused through one immortal will. What I felt was smaller than that, more fragile, more uncertain, a pulse, irregular but present, like something trying to restart, like a signal fighting through interference rather than projecting freely. It lasted for 47 minutes by my chronometer. It was enough to give me a confirmed positional fix. It was enough to adjust our course by 11 degrees in the correct direction. Then it stopped again. I did not know if it would return. I did not know if what I had felt was the Astronomicon restoring or the last desperate surge of a flame that was going out. My ancestral record had said it returned. My great-great-grandmother's notation had not explained what that meant. But 47 minutes was enough. I had the fix. I had the course. On the morning of the 7th day, we translated from the warp. We came out above a world called Kravis 3, which was not our destination but was within reach of its coordinates and possessed a proper astropathic relay, which was what mattered. The translation was rough, as translations always are after extended warp time, and 3 crew members in the aft engineering section suffered psychic bleed-through from the transit, which the Medicaoster treated with the quiet competence that characterized all his work. Captain Veth summoned me to the bridge when I had rested. 12 hours. She had given me 12 hours, which was more than I had expected. On the bridge, with her officers around her, and the blue-gray surface of Crevasse III filling the main viewport, she told me what the astropathic relay had reported. The Astronomicon had suffered a diminishment event. Not a failure, not precisely, a diminishment. The official communique, relayed from Terra through the astropathic chain, described it as a temporary reduction in signal strength owing to warp weather of exceptional severity in the stellar approaches to Holy Terra. It stated that the signal had been restored. It stated that navigators who had reported anomalous beacon conditions should have their reports reviewed by the relevant authorities. It stated that the cause of the diminishment was under investigation. It did not name the investigation's conclusions. It did not name the duration of the event or its exact extent. It did not name how many ships had been in transit when it occurred or what had happened to them. I looked at Captain Veth. She looked at me. 17 documented instances, she said, in 4 centuries. This would be the 18th, I said. She was quiet for a moment. Or the first 17 were the same event, recorded separately by different navigators, who each thought they were alone. She paused. They were alone. She paused. How many ships are in transit at any given moment, fleet-wide? Several 100,000, I said. And how many of those navigators, if they experienced what you experienced, would report it to their captains? I thought of my great-great-grandmother. I thought of the Navigator Vale of House Fulk, my captain's cousin, who had reported anomalous beacon conditions and been taken into custody. I thought of the revised transit log entries I had written and what they did not contain. Fewer than the number who experienced it, I said. She nodded. There will be an inquisitorial review at our next port of call, she said. Your log will be reviewed. I will note that I reviewed it and found it consistent with the reports I received from you verbally. That is what you said you would do, I said. Yes. She paused. Theomar, what you saw, in the warp, in the place where the Astronomicon was, what was it? I considered how to answer this. I considered what it would mean to answer it accurately, in the presence of her officers, on the record of a bridge that had active logging protocols. I saw interference, I said. Background warp fee. Enomina. Nothing significant. She looked at me for a moment with the expression that had catalogued structural weaknesses for 30 years. Yes, she said. That is what the log will reflect. I am recording this in a personal journal that I intend to bind into the back of the ancestral record volume, in the manner of my great-great-grandmother, so that whoever finds it may know they are not alone. I am alive. I am currently Navigator First Class Theomar Vale Obscurus, recently promoted on the strength of the successful transit of the immovable faith through a period of beacon instability. The promotion came with a commendation from Captain Veth. The inquisitorial review found my log entries consistent with operational norms. I was not remanded to any authority. I do not know if I am telling you this as comfort or as warning. Perhaps both. Here is what I know. The Astronomicon is not what I was taught it was. Not false, not absent, not negligible, but not a steady and eternal lighthouse burning outside the concerns of human history. It is a thing that burns in the warp, and the warp is a thing that changes, and the change I witnessed is not the first change, and will not be the last. The vast quiet presence in the place where the light had been. I do not know what it was. I know that it was old. I know that it watched something I could not perceive. I know that when the Astronomicon's pulse returned briefly, the presence did not retreat from it. They were both there, for 47 minutes, the ancient silence and the struggling light, coexistent. My tutors in House Obscurus taught me that the Emperor's light was a weapon against the dark. Brother Hadrianus told me, In the chapel that the God Emperor stood between mankind and what the darkness contains, not above it, between. What I saw in the Immaterium in 6 days of pulsar mapping without the beacon was that what stands between two things is not above either of them. It is surrounded by both of them. It is in contact with both of them. It maintains its position not by absence of the dark, but by presence within it, by being perpetually at the point where the dark is. I do not know if this is heresy. I do not know if it is theology. I am a navigator, not a theologian. I know the Immaterium, and I know what I perceived in it, and what I perceived does not fit any language I was given. The light stutters, the warp watches, the ship goes on. I keep my bandeau on. I say my prayers. I open my third eye every 4 hours, and I look for the beacon, and most of the time it is there, silver gold and present, and I am grateful in a way that I was not grateful before, the way you are grateful for things only after you have lost them and found them again. 3 weeks ago, I was in the chapel with Hadrianus when he asked me if my faith had been damaged by the transit. I thought about this for a long time. My faith in the Astronauchan as I understood it, I said, yes, completely. And in the Emperor. My faith in the Emperor as I understood him, I said, also yes. But I am no longer certain that my understanding was the important part. He considered this. I find that answer more honest than most of the theology I have read, he said. The dark side of that honesty, I said, is that I do not know what I have faith in anymore. Only that something was there, and something is still there, and it is not what I thought it was, and I navigate by it because there is nothing else to navigate by, and because it brought us home. He nodded slowly. That may be the oldest and most accurate definition of faith I have heard, he said. I looked at the candles. They were beeswax, small and steady, burning in the recycled air of a ship that was still flying. The static of a dying star map, I said, to no one in particular. What? Something I was thinking, I said. What I recorded, in the dark, the thinning, the stuttering, the absence. It felt like listening to static on a Vox channel where the signal used to be, not silence. Not exactly. Something in between. And now, he said, the signal returned. It returned, I said, changed, or I am changed. I cannot determine which. He was quiet for a long time. In the scriptures, he said, the navigation of the soul and the navigation of the stars are described in the same language. I used to think that was poetry, and now I think, he said, carefully, that whoever wrote the scriptures may have been a navigator. Outside the chapel porthole, the stars burned steady and cold and the material dark, indifferent, constant, older than anything we worshipped or feared. Somewhere beyond them, in the space between spaces, the Astronomicon held its difficult light. I am alive. I have been alive through things that should have broken me. I record this testimony because my great-great-grandmother wrote, "Someone must know, someone must remember. This is what it is like to hold the light when the light flickers. This is what it costs. This is what you find in the place where the beacon was, when the beacon goes out. I do not have a name for it. I only know it was watching, and when the light came back it was still there. The static is not silence. The silence is not absence. The dark between the stars is not empty. Navigate accordingly." Testimony of Navigator First Class Theomar Vale Obscurus, House Obscurus, bound into Ancestral Record Volume, Transit Year 846, M41. Filed under Personal Notation, not for inquisitorial review. May whoever finds this know.